Our speaker for today is Dr. Nicole Morris, and she will present on the redesign of Minnesota's crash report system. Dr. Morris is the principal researcher of the Human First Laboratory in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, is a research scholar at the Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota, and holds a PhD in human factor psychology. Dr. Morris's research focuses on human-computer interactions with technology related to various aspects of transportation. Her research interests include multisensory perception, aging, judgment and decision-making, usability in human factors. With that, let's welcome Dr. Nicole Morris.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak on this project, which I'm really proud of, and so any opportunity I have to tell more people about what we did, it's a really exciting opportunity. So some of you may be aware that Minnesota recently sort of rebuilt its whole back-end system for our crash records holding system. And this was a long time coming. From what I understand, the system that was housing all of our crash data in Minnesota was sort of being held together with Band-Aids, it seemed like. And we really couldn't make any changes to the data because the system couldn't sort of accept any changes. And I came into University of Minnesota and the Traffic Records Coordinating Committee at just the right time when they were starting to really ramp up for this process. And so in this conversation, they were saying, you know, it's so hard to train officers to document a crash and use the form, and they make all of these errors, and now we're going to have a new form, and we're going to have to retrain them. And it was really talking intensive on training. And you know, my expertise is really how can we build a system to better accommodate users and not have to train out all of these errors. Let's make a system that's really error-free and really accommodates all of our cognitive constraints and limitations as people. And so I sort of like, I know I'm new here, this is my very first meeting, but really, how about you train and hire a human factor psychologist to help you rebuild the new crash report? So then you have this really slick new thing that you don't have to train your officers to use. It's just intuitive, and they know exactly how to document that crash. And thankfully, since we're in the great state of Minnesota, they said, let's do it, right? So I'm going to give you a really brief background on human factors, and maybe you're really familiar with human factors, and this is nothing new. But really, you know, I'm housed in mechanical engineering, and so people assume I'm an engineer, and then sometimes I'll slip in that I'm a psychologist, and then they want me to give them mental health advice. And so, you know, I can judge you, but, you know, not in a way that's going to be helpful, right? So what is a human factors psychologist or a human factors engineer? We're really two sides of the same coin, but really it's that interaction between the human and the machine. And how can we really facilitate that so it's a really smooth interaction with very little error? And for transportation, and we're talking about the big thing here is no fatalities. It's the thing that we're shooting for. So human factors transportation is a really big area. It's been a big area for a long time. And really, so it's what are the limitations and capabilities of people? What do we know about those limitations and capabilities? And how can we better design the system so we're working around that? You know, we're not doing like what we used to do before World War II, where you have a tiny machine and a tiny little hole, so you find somebody with tiny hands. You know, and that's how we used to work away and troubleshoot around these issues, is you'd find a person that could do the job instead of fixing the system so everybody could use it safely, right? So, you know, we use our knowledge, and really when you apply that to something like the crash report, we're really going to minimize how much effort it takes, right? So when law enforcement officers sort of sign up for the gig, they're not signing up for the gig to do paperwork, right? They're not really thinking, I'm going to spend my time sitting at a laptop with a bunch of gear on my body, sitting there for an hour and a half trying to document a single crash. That's not what they're getting in for. So we want this to be really fast. We don't want there to be a lot of error, because the crash data is ground zero for everything we know about transportation safety in our state and in our country, right? And we sort of trust this data to be very good, but it's only as good as the data that we're getting from the officer. And for one, they're limited because they weren't there when the crash happened, right? So they're kind of determining all this post hoc. So we already are limited in what they can discern what happened in the crash because they're showing up after the fact. And then we're going to create this really complicated screen in between their knowledge and our interpretation of that knowledge, because the interface can be so lousy that it really hinders their ability to tell us that story, right? And then, to make things even more complicated, we have something like 70,000 crashes a year in Minnesota, so we can't go through and read every single narrative, right? And they'll spend a lot of time writing sort of a novel almost in the narrative to tell us everything that they know, but we don't have time to read that. So we need to be able to discern it through the data. The data has to be really clean, and so the interface has to be really smooth, really seamless, so we can tell exactly what happened in that crash through the data, right? So these things get more and more complex, and every year the federal government is asking for more and more information out of these officers, and we're squeezing them and squeezing them. Tell us more. The system is getting more and more complex. We have to work around that. And the problem is, oftentimes when we build a really complex system, you don't bring in human factors until after the fact, right? So you design something, and then all of a sudden these errors are coming in, and they bring in somebody like my research lab and say, help us fix this. Well, it's too costly, right? It takes too much time to fix these things after the fact. So you always want to be bringing in human factors people early in the design, early in that design cycle. So we're fixing those errors as you go along the way, and that's what made this project so beautiful with the state of Minnesota, is they actually did bring me in really early in the design cycle, long before they even hired a vendor to build the actual system. We were there working out all the kinks, so by the time we were ready to go live, it was a really slick system. Okay. So this I took off of a bulletin board in Duluth, Minnesota, and we went all over the state for this. But this is, one of those, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and this really tells you where we were before we redid our crash report in Minnesota. So this poor officer, he was working the night shift and trying to document a crash. And the way that the interface worked at that time was it had a bunch of rules in there. It was sort of rigid, and if you didn't tell it exactly what it wanted to know, it wouldn't accept, right? You couldn't submit your crash report. You couldn't print it out. And there was some sort of error that he was making. Tired officer, can't blame him. And at some point, just in his sort of fatigue, and threw up his hands and scrawled this and submitted it to the captain and went home for the night, right? And this is really common with a lot of complex systems where the user blames themselves, right? I'm just too stupid to understand how to work this. And the engineers are going, they're too stupid to understand how to use our system. If they would just be smarter, and everybody, sort of blaming the user. But we really need to know, what is it about the user and how can we help them so they don't ever feel stupid and they don't ever get to this place of just throwing up their hands. So that was our objective, is how can we redesign a new report that's going to be really fast, really accurate, really reliable, and the data that we get is really meaningful. It's this purest sort of form of what actually happened at the scene of the crash as possible. So we're not really degrading the story that the officer is telling through this really clunky interface. And so I basically pulled out every single tool and trick that I had in my bag for human factors analyses and put it into this project. So a lot of things that we did, if I were to present this to a group of human factors, they would say this is nothing new, right? But it's new because it's not typically applied in a system like this. So no state has ever done a rework of their crash interface in the way that we did and applied these human factors principles to it. So I'm going to go through some of these, but we sort of went through this step by step, and this took us several years to do the whole thing, and so it was really great that we had the time and space to do this really well. But the biggest thing was really working with the user, working with officers hand in hand. But before we did that, we had to do some sort of back-end system ourselves to figure out how does the system work currently. And so we did something that's called a hierarchical task analysis, and it's really kind of creating that cookbook, every single direction, every single step that a user has to do to interact with the system. And no step is too small, and it accounts for all of those if-then statements. So you sort of understand the rules of the crash report. So if it's a snowplow, since we're in Minnesota, if it's a snowplow and the plow is down, it is not a motor vehicle in transport, it's a working vehicle. And so that changes all the ways that you interact with it. And so knowing what are all the rules, does the user need to know that rule to interact with a report appropriately? So this is just kind of a pictorial diagram. We couldn't in the end do an actual pictorial diagram of the original report because it was something like 3,000 lines. So it would have just gone on forever and ever and ever. But what was really neat as we started to do this, it helped us identify what's some of the low-hanging fruit. So some of these things were kind of shocking to me as I dove into the project, but these are some of the very first things. So, right, they want to document a crash, and the first thing that they had to do was enter their officer information, right? They're already logged into the system. They're already logged in, but yet, what's your name? What's your rank? What agency are you with? What's your badge number? If you're state patrol, what's your state patrol number? Right? 5 steps, just get rid of that. We can just, knock these things out. So it's always exciting when I have, as I'm sure you know, low-hanging fruit is always good. So by the end of this whole process, we identified there were about 175 steps, so 175 individual things an officer would have to document, and this is for a single unit crash, right? Just one unit. And then we were really looking at what's the division of labor between the user and the report, right? Because anytime the system can take some of that responsibility from the user, you're going to minimize error, right? The more things that you can automate, as long as it's automated well, right, you're going to reduce that error opportunity. But there were very few things that this system could do. It was a very unintelligent sort of form. So out of this 175, there were 24 things maximum that it could do. And that was based off of our min-fill thing. So if you typed in the DL, you could hit min-fill, and it would auto-populate all the information from the database about that person. But it was limited to only people that lived in Minnesota. So if they're from Wisconsin or, our Bloomington Police Department that are doing things in Mall of America, people from all over the country, that's going to be very little use to them because it didn't have capability to do that nationwide. So this was really one of our really big goals because the more things that we can pull off the officer, the more we can improve accuracy and we can speed up the process, right? So anything that kind of just fills itself for them, they're going to speed through this much faster. One of the interesting things when I was working with officers, we assumed that they're doing this in their squad car, right? And so we thought we're going to have to do all these ergonomic things about, them turning and working off their laptop. Turns out none of them, of all the agencies that I interacted with, and I interacted with something like 80, none of them filled it out in their squad car, right? So that was interesting because the state assumed that's what they were doing, that they were filling it out in their squad car. Well, it would take like 45 minutes to fill this thing out. So who's going to sit on a little laptop all turned within your squad car filling that out? No. So they would do it the next day, or maybe 2 days later, or maybe 3 days later, back at their squad at a desktop computer, right? So now even more so, losing memory. And so they would have a little notepad and a few notes. And then they're filling out most of the stuff based off of memory. So again, degrading this information, it's not very pure because we have all of these things in the system that are impeding our ability to get really good quality data. So the faster we can get them to do that, the more they're able to do it in their squad car, the fresher that information is going to be. So I pulled a lot of this out and something we call cognitive walkthrough analysis. And really that's just me sitting down with an expert and saying, tell me how you do your job. Think aloud as much as possible. No detail is unimportant. I'm going to write it all down and we'll really figure out kind of what are the trends and some of the information that you think you're doing something and you're getting some sort of outcome, but we know that that's an unintended consequence. So it helps us to figure out, are there assumptions correct about how the report works? Are there any validity or reliability issues? So are they saying what they think that they're saying? All right, so if they think that they're saying that something is a motor vehicle in transport, is it really, and do they understand what that means? And is there good reliability? So do we find consistency within a station, across agencies, all of those things, right? Because we don't want different voices coming through and different trends through the state. We want a really nice united view of all of our crashes across Minnesota, and we don't want that to vary based off of officer or agency. So some of the things that I pulled out right away, which were really interesting, information about our hit and runs was really flawed. So there was a part in the crash report that you had to select just right to get it to recognize that one of these vehicles was a hit and run vehicle. In the previous report, if you didn't do that, then it would force you to tell the system information about the driver and the vehicle that you didn't know. And it would not submit and it would not accept the report until you told it what it wanted to know. So what would you do? Give it what it wants to know, right? So we're potentially getting flawed data, right? Fake data. Just put it in, make some guesses, right? And that's what I would do, and that's what they were doing. The other thing is parked vehicles. So if it's a parked vehicle and there's no driver in the driver's seat, if you don't code that just right, it's forcing you to give information about the position of the driver and where were they. And so they're just having to take that data as well, because it won't accept until you do it appropriately. So sequence of events, this is my favorite part of the report because it was such a disaster. I feel like a candidate. It was such a disaster. And anyway, so basically the sequence of events is really the place where the officer tells you kind of play by play what happened in the crash through the data, right? You can easily do this through the narrative, but like I said, we have 70,000 crashes. There's no way we can read the narrative of all of it. So we want to know play by play what happened through the data, and you do that through the sequence of events. There's 4 opportunities to say this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this is the worst thing of those 4 that happened, okay? Fairly straightforward. Almost every officer would type 01 into the first sequence. The other 3 are optional. Leave those blank, 01 and the most harmful, and move on, right? And we would say, why would you do it that way? Well, I was trained to do it that way, or my buddy told me to do it that way, and that's the way I do it. So what they thought that they were saying was it's a motor vehicle and transport, and it got in a crash. I know there's a lot of detail in that because it's a crash report, and most of them are motor vehicle and transport. But they didn't understand it, and they would say, I don't understand this part of the report, I'll put it in the narrative. You know, and again, rightly so. They don't understand, the system is very clunky. But what they didn't know they were saying was this is a collision with a motor vehicle and transport, right? Assuming that there are 2, you have to have at least 2 units in the crash for that to even be a possibility, and they would put that for a single unit crash. The single unit, right? It crossed the center line, and then it went off the road, and then it hit a tree, and all of those things we want to know in the sequence of events, but they didn't understand how to interact with the report, and so they didn't do it. The other problem is that drop-down list had something like almost 50, 60 options in it, right? So you want to hunt and peck through 60 options to find the right solution? No, neither do I. So all of our non-collision events were really underutilized. When I looked through the data, I found less than 1% of the time were they coding that we had across the center line or run off the road right or left. Right? And if you're really familiar with the crash data and our fatal data, you know that that's what, like 50% of our fatals are run off the road crashes. We're not getting any data about when and where and how that's happening through cross the road or, you know, cross the center line or run off the road right or left because they don't understand this part of the report. Other implications, so this is kind of getting to some of the cultural things, and a caveat is I didn't crack this nut, but just want to let you know that this is an interesting thing. There are some court implications. So officers would routinely tell me that they were hesitant to include factors that they could not prove in court. Right? So they don't want to say that the driver was distracted if they can't prove that they were distracted. Right? They don't want to say they were speeding if they can't prove that they were speeding. And so I would say very naively, because I heard this around the block, well, the crash report's not admissible in court, and you shouldn't worry about that. Tell us whatever you think, and you shouldn't be worried about having to stand that up in court. And then they would laugh in my face, and they would say, well, tell that to the defense attorneys who use it in court all of the time. And I'm going like, I don't know what to say. But apparently, maybe this, I mean, so maybe we have some legal experts in the room, but I think what it is you can't submit the crash report as evidence in court, but that doesn't prevent the defense attorney from holding it in their hand and using it in a line of questioning with the officer sitting on the stand. Right? So we're not protecting our officers. And so they have this other concern that's preventing us from knowing what they think might have happened in the crash, even if they can't prove it, which is a real concern. So let me know if you have a solution that I can pass along. The other thing is we have reconstruction constraints. So if it's some sort of a crash where they may be doing a reconstruction, so this may be some sort of crash where there may be charges involved, the reporting officer does not want to include elements that are going to be coded and determined by the reconstruction team. So they don't want to say, I think that they were going 70 miles an hour in a 50. I'm going to leave that to the reconstruction team, so I'm going to not guess, even though we're asking them to guess. They're going to say they don't know, because culturally, if within their agency, if they say something and the reconstruction team says something else, then that's bad within the department. They don't like to contradict one another. The problem, that would be fine if the reconstruction report fed back into our original report and corrected it and gave us that good quality data that comes out of the reconstruction report. It doesn't. So we're left with 99s and zeros and whatever within our report because they say they don't know. So we did a card sorting task with something like, 167 officers, and it's basically like you would guess. We put all of these things, all the different things within the report, and we have them sort them into piles. And it seems like a really simplistic task, but it's really powerful because it allows a human factors person to get the user to say, these are how I sort of group these things in my own mind, and allows us to sort of re-envision, reimagine how we might want to reorganize the report in a way that's intuitive to the user, because the existing report was really intuitive to the analyst, and it wasn't intuitive to the user. So we did that. That was really great. And then we're able to sort of merge all of that. So as the lines get thicker, we have more and more agreement from officers that those things get grouped together. And so then we start to find these sort of groupings and trends. And none of this was super revolutionary in comparison to how things were grouped previously, but it really helped inform us about, for sure, what should we be having grouped together within the report so it's really intuitive. And we started sort of building this report structure. But the thing that was most powerful about how we regrouped it was doing this one-to-many structure, which seems really obvious, but the existing report wasn't structured that way. So they had some stuff at the crash level, a little bit of location data, but then they went to drivers and units, and you kind of bounced back and forth, but there wasn't any real flow to how you did it. And then at the end, you went back to the crash level stuff. So it kind of went back and forth, and there was no really intuitive flow. And the officer said, I really want to start everything at the crash level, document that, and then work my way out. And what's interesting was they didn't want just that. They wanted even things within the driver to kind of walk its way back from the crash. So there's a lot of information we ask about the driver. And some of those things are sort of more about the unit, right? Were they wearing their seatbelt? Right, that's an information about the driver, but it's sort of related to the unit. So ask that first because we're moving away from the unit. And then something like, were they intoxicated? That's nothing to do with the unit, and that's about the person. So ask that next, if that makes sense. So all of this was really deliberate and structured in the way that made sense and had that natural flow to how they would tell the story. So as we started doing this, we really started to mock this up. So we started creating crash report. And we would build it so it was sort of a single unit crash and take it out to users, have them test it. What do you like? What do you hate? We'll fix it. Then we built it so it could do 2 units and 3 units and so on and so on. So it was really this iterative design. And so we figured out, where are they making errors? What do they like? What do they hate? And we heard early on from officers that they really like a wizard-based interface. So if you're unfamiliar with a wizard-based interface, that's kind of like what you interact with when you download software. Kind of pop up window by window, and it takes you through all of the steps, versus the form, which I say form, and that's kind of clunky, but a screen where you have lots of questions all at once, and so you're going to go through like 50 questions on a screen is what they had currently, with multiple tabs, but still a lot of questions at once. And they had an e-charging system that they were using that was a wizard, and they would say that's officer-proof, that's what I want. And so we decided we would build both in the early stages and figure out which one do they like, which one do they not like, and then we'll build the one that's most preferred. And so that was our original plan. Some of the benefits of a wizard is it is really step-by-step, but it really restricts the user in how they're going to interact with it. So if they want to jump ahead, it's very hard, right? It really restricts their flow, takes their hand and forces them to interact with the report in a certain way. Whereas a form, they can kind of bounce all over any which way they want, but there is some opportunity for error because it's not kind of taking them through step-by-step, question by question. But we really thought, that makes sense, maybe fine to do a wizard for your e-charging, but the crash report is going to have something like 200 questions for a single unit crash. So maybe that's too many screens, and they'll get really screen fatigue. And so we wanted them to really test this and see, does it really hold true that they would like a wizard for this type of thing? So this gives you a breakdown of what I mean when there's so many screens. So for our form base, so we have multiple fields, multiple drop down on a single screen, where on our wizard you have maybe 1 to 3 questions per screen. And as it gets more complex, down here, a 1 unit, 2 unit, a commercial motor vehicle, fatal 3 unit, it does go up in screens, but not that much, right? But for your wizard, you start with 37 screens for a single unit and 120 screens for a 3-unit crash. So that's a lot of clicking next. Like, I just couldn't see myself wanting to do that. But we thought, it's not for me to decide, we'll get the user to decide. And so we took out that, original prototype, which one do you like, and sort of went from there. Some of the things that we built into it were a lot of hyperlinks. So there's a lot of information that they need to know, a lot of back-end rules that are very complicated that they would end up having to consult a manual, call the captain back at the station, and we didn't want them to have to go through so many steps. So we wanted to embed some of that information or put in hyperlinks within the report. So it's just one click away that they can find that information that we know are sort of problem places within the report that we sort of routinely came across that they don't understand this information. And if it was something that was like very common, a very common understanding, you don't even want to leave that to a hyperlink. Put that right on the screen because you know everybody's making that mistake. And one of the mistakes is we ask about public property damage. So this would be something like, a cable median barrier. That would be public property damage. Private property damage would be something like a privacy fence, right? But officers routinely, when they would get to this place, if it was a police car that was damaged, they would think of that as public property. And then they would take the time to retell you all the information in this section about that police car when they already did that for Unit 2 in vast detail, right? So we want to really save them that step. Don't take the time to tell us about that unit. You already told us about that unit. And it turned out that they would do that. Some of them, I won't name which police department, but one of the police departments would do that even with privately owned vehicles. So again, they would spend, 50-some questions or something documenting a unit that a person owned, and then they would re-describe it in this section because it's privately owned. So you want to put that information to save them from themselves. Other things is just kind of embedding in some nice diagrams. So knowing where things are in the traffic way, I'm sure as engineers you know exactly where things are within the traffic way, but the officers don't know this information. So getting them that diagram information is really nice. Things about, what makes something a working vehicle when it's a snowplow. Oh, no, I hit end. Sorry. So, there's a lot of rules about a snowplow. Is it plow down and that makes it a working vehicle? Things like that. So putting in some of those rules it's good to save them from themselves. It says Microsoft Office is not responding. Okay, there we go. Okay, I feel like it's jumping. So another thing, so this is a new part of the report that they didn't have before, so we wanted to make sure it was really slick for them. Well, let me scratch that. They had part of this already, and we added another section. But it's so, they used to tell us kind of where on the unit things were damaged, and they had to do this from a drop-down list. So basically, they had to think about this bird's eye view and where something was. So the front right and the back left, and do that, and then pick it from the drop-down menu. But in the NCITE or in the MUC manual, they had all these really slick 12-point diagrams as tools, and we're like, well, let's just build that into the report. So now what pops up is exactly this, and then those are buttons that they just click and say here, 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 and they move on. So they have that, and then we have, what's frustrating for them is they have, so this is initial point of contact, this is what's new. So they used to say what was damaged. Now they have to say what was initially damaged, and then all the places that were damaged. which I'm sure they're not happy about. But it's important to sort of know the first point of contact and then everything that was damaged in the vehicle. Okay, well, this is my pride and joy. It's my baby. So remember I was telling you that that sequence of events was really clunky. They didn't understand it, but a really big part of the crash report. And so what we did was we basically came up with a decision tree, and this is really what we call a nested menu. So when they get to this section, this is not what it looks like today because we didn't end up building a wizard like this, but for this section, they get to sequence of events 1, and then they have 3 initial options. So we purposefully put lane departure and non-collision events first, even though that was originally at the very bottom of that drop-down list, opportunities or options. We really want them to highlight and exaggerate how important it is to tell us about lane departure events or non-collision events. Then also, since before they didn't know that it was a collision with a motor vehicle transport, that's very explicit here, so they can see that that's what they're saying. So they choose from one of these things, and then they get just the list that applies to that drop-down. So they're not overwhelmed with 60-some options within the drop-down list, and it really guides them and gears them into what's possible. Then when they get to the most harmful event, it has a drop-down of only the 4 that they selected. Right? So then they don't have to choose from the entire list. It shows them these are the 4 things that you said happened in the sequence of events. Which of those 4 was the most harmful? So it's really slick, really great part of the report. So how we did this was we did 4 major rounds of usability testing. Like I said, as we built it, we would test it. So we'd have a single unit crash, and we take it out and test it, go back, make changes, build it up. And so by the time we went to our 4th round, we had sort of this full report that could document a school bus fatality. All terrible things, right? But we could do kind of any sort of turn of events in our report. So they interacted with it. We went all over the state. If there was like an empty seat on the MnDOT plane, we would fly all the way up to Baudette. We wanted as many voices. We didn't want this to be a metro voice sort of thing. We wanted officers from all over the state to have their input. So we really went everywhere and asked them about it. So what did we find? Like I said, my original plan was I was going to test out really early on, did they like the form, did they like the wizard, and I would build one. Right, that was really what was in my contract. And so I went out first time, and we did testing, and it was 50-50. So we're like, okay, they're not getting the gravity of how many screens there's going to be with this wizard. Let's give them a 2-unit crash, and then we'll retest. And surely something will come out. 50-50. And then a 3-unit, and then a fatal, and then a CMV, and a school bus. 50-50. I even had one time we did, some of our subjective usability testing. So we were asking workload, and we had this sort of scale about usability. One time the mean and the standard deviation for both came out identical. I mean, it was just baffling, very frustrating. And so, I kept going, but I kept going back to the state and saying, like, I can't choose. I can't choose which of these interfaces is better. It really needs to be chosen by the officer, and that's what they kept saying. And so in the end, since there were no significant differences of either one of the interfaces, and we had voices that really liked the one for valid reasons and voices that really liked another for other valid reasons, the state finally said, well, let's build both, and we'll give them both. Now we can talk about the potential validity and reliability issues with 2 different interfaces later, but in the short run, it's a big sort of success for the user because we have some really computer savvy younger officers that really whiz through the form. And they like it, they like the flexibility, they're really fast with it. And then we have some less tech-savvy users that are really intimidated by working with computers, and the wizard's perfect for them. It really holds their hand and walks them through. And so the state said, fine, we'll build them both, and that's what they did. And then I think going forward, they intend to continue to reevaluate and figure maybe we'll start to see a tipping point that one's being used more than the other, and they may phase one out, but that remains to be seen. So through this process, through the iterative design, one of our big successes was shifting that ratio of responsibility from the user to the system. So I'll highlight here what we did. We found so many opportunities. It was so intelligent that if we could figure out something like how it worked in the previous report, it would say, did this occur in a work zone? And the officer would say, no. And then the next question would say, where in the work zone? And they would have to say, not applicable. Were there police at the work zone? Not applicable. There were 5 more questions about work zones that they would have to answer because the previous report was just not very intelligent. So there were lots of opportunities like that where we could say, you said no, we're going to eliminate these questions, grade them out, and so that auto-populates all those not applicable for the officer. And so in the end, under optimal conditions, we had enough min-fill functions and auto-population functions and just, pulled out enough things. And our optimal conditions, it was a 1-to-1 ratio, that half of the things could be auto-populated by the system. That's really going to speed up things for the user, which is really great. Okay, so Minnesota DPS hired this company named Apris. And originally, I have to say that my contract was supposed to end at this point, and I was going to hand off my wireframes to that company. I think we have somebody in the room that was going, that's not a good idea. Maybe we should make sure that Human First stays on board to make sure that they implement everything, right? And after my experience with this process, I would say that was really smart because, all these companies that build software assume that they know how to do it really well. But I interacted with the owners of this company, and they had never heard of human factors before. It's a software company. So, they had a lot of confidence that they knew how to build these things really well, and I have little confidence that they would have really implemented our research findings. So our contract was extended, and then we got to oversee as they were building these things. And so we tested each and every function. We did all the QA for them. And we kept saying, this isn't right, you didn't implement our changes here. My nice, beautiful sequence of events, nested menu, I think it took me 6 months to twist their arm to finally build that dang thing. So, it was an interesting process. But in the end, they built actually 6. So I will give it to them that they built 6 interfaces. It was a lot of work because we had to build a web-based version, something that would have internet connectivity, but then there had to be a standalone client where you didn't have internet. And officers wanted something called a quick capture, so that quick exchange of information at the scene of the crash, so they could give information to the drivers and go back to the station. So they built this first thing called the quick capture, which we did some testing, but it was not based off of our design. Then the wizard, which was, they called this a best of breed approach. So they already had an off-the-shelf wizard. And so basically, they just sort of took some of our recommendations of the wizard. So that's why I was saying that previous image you saw, this is nothing like what we recommended. But it is a wizard. And then the last one was the form. And this one really is pretty true to our design. And I believe this is the one that State Patrol uses exclusively. So it was a lot of work, a lot of testing to make sure that all of these things matched and had the same capabilities and functions, because we didn't want them to have a different user experience if they were interacting with the web-based version than the standalone version. So it was a lot of testing. So then we were in our final stretch. So once they were getting close to going live, we continued to stay on the project and make sure it was working as intended. We did more usability testing, so then we took their product and went back out to officers and tested that to make sure that everything was working as they would expect it to work. And it was pretty positive. It was really interesting how quickly they could interact with the report, about 20 minutes to document a crash where it was taking them close to an hour before. So it was really great. So where are we now? Well, the min crash system went live January 1, which a lot of people that were on the ground, I think, were not sure that we were actually going to hit that goal, but we did. It was really exciting and really positive feedback from the officers. I heard from State Patrol that they're not saying a whole lot about the new report. And if you know anything about State Patrol, apparently no news is good news. So they must not hate it, at least. So what's next for us? I will say, without a shred of doubt, we have produced a report that is intuitive, it's user-friendly, it's not going to be an experience that officers are going to be frustrated, it's going to be a really smooth data entry experience. But the big question is, have we actually improved the data, right? We really need to put our money where our mouth is and show that we've actually gotten more complete, more accurate, more valid data. And so I'm working with the state on a new project that's going to start in the winter. We're going to examine a couple of things. One, all the old data that was coded according to the old report is going to have to be converted to match how the data is coded for the new report. There's a lot of opportunities for potential error there and distorting the data. So we're going to be analyzing that to make sure everything's on the up and up with that conversion. And we're going to be looking at the validity and reliability of the new crash data to make sure that we have more complete data. So looking at how often are we doing others and unknowns compared to before. Are we having a more complete sequence of events? And we're going to be validating it with things in their narrative. So we're going to spot check about 700 crashes to see what are they telling us in our narrative, and is that matching what they put into the data? Are we better facilitating their ability to tell us in data what happened in the crash? And then if we find any problems or areas within the report that we think are creating problems on the back end of the data, then we'll be making recommendations on how to improve the front end of the data as well. So I want to thank my staff, Jen Cooper, Jake Ochtemeyer, Alice Tahn. A big thanks to Kathleen Haney at Minnesota DPS and the Traffic Records Coordinating Committee for funding this project, Brad Astosh and Katie Fleming at MnDOT. And then these are all the police departments, sheriff's departments, and state patrol that interacted with us and gave us their time to build this new report. So it's really exciting and wide encompassing project. That's it. Any questions? Yeah.
The most useful part of the report is looking at analysis of the narrative. Is there any thoughts or work on that?
So we did kick around some ideas about how can we improve the narrative. So, I think that we didn't do this in the end, but I think it's still possible that we could use some of the data and auto-populate some lines of the narrative. So some of those things like, John Doe was driving Unit 1 and Jane Joe was driving Unit 2. Those things that they put in the narrative, they don't need to spend their time telling us that because we already know that in the data. So I think that would really facilitate that. One of the things is I believe that they put in a note to try to encourage them to scrub out personal identifying characteristics, because I think that's something that really impedes people's ability to access the narrative when there's personal information that has to be scrubbed out, because Minnesota's like iron-fisted with that information.
What's the timeline for getting the pre-2016 data into the same format, and then what, in the next year, I'm going to have to do an analysis that has 14, 15, 16 in it, so how's that going to work?
I think it's going to happen pretty fast. I think they're already doing it, actually. And my assumption was, based off of my conversations with DPS, when I start this in November, all that data will be converted already. So, I think it was just a process of writing the syntax to get it to happen. But then we want to scrub through and make sure. I mean, sometimes you all of a sudden wind up with a bunch of 17-year-olds who should have been 16 because it's coding their date of birth wrong, and so little things can happen in the conversion that can give us spurious results.
Maybe the data capture does this, but they're like a fault-based GPS coordinate kind of snap ability, because my experience is getting the location right.
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, right.
Coded a quarter mile away from the intersection where it actually happened.
Yeah. So I don't typically talk about it because I don't like to take credit for it, but there is a really slick new function in the crash report. So basically, instead of manually entering any of the location information, there's basically like a map it button that uses their GPS coordinate, and then they kind of just have to zoom in, they click down into the map, and then they just click right there, and then it does all the lat long, and it's like, I don't know, 20-some variables that get coded through that map. And I think there are some hiccups early on with getting that to work really well, But I think that's really going to improve our data accuracy for location and again, really speed up that process because that's 20 things that the officer used to have to do manually, and now it's automated for them. So it's really slick.
There's some error checking ways in there. Just like one thing that I've seen is up above it, you'll say direction of travel, and then you go down and read the narrative, and they're going a different direction, or they're turned 90 degrees, or, so when you go actively through it, is there something that catch those errors?
I don't know if it would catch that. There are a lot of business rules that catch a ton of stuff now. So once they submit, it'll have kind of a whole laundry list of warnings, so things that the report's going like, I don't think this is right, but we're not going to force you to fix it. And then there are critical errors that you better fix this because we're not submitting until you do. And so it kind of weights some of those things. But most of the errors, we really hope that we worked out on the front end, so you just can't make them because it just doesn't allow you to interact with it in that way. There is going to be some more information about roadway information. So the previous crash report had all the roadway information at the crash level, and now it's broken at the unit level. So, it used to only ask for a single roadway information and single speed limit and curve of the road and that type of thing. Those are now at the unit level because, you may have an intersection where one roadway is 50 and one is 60 and cars are coming from different directions. I'm interested to look at that data because the officers really feel like now that they're providing redundant information. They're like, I already told you this information and now I'm having to say it again. But one of the features that we put in was same as Unit 1. So they put it in for Unit 1, and then if they get to Unit 2 and none of that information is different, then they can click same as Unit 1 and it auto-populates all that information. I mean, they can change what they would like, but so we'll see how often they're using that same as Unit 1, and in the end we may actually get no different information for the units, which may be an unintended consequence of my design.
So this law requires citizens to fill out reports in certain circumstances. Is there any talk of letting this be available to the public?
So I don't know if any other tiers. Do you think I can say what I don't know.
Yeah.
So I've heard that the citizens report goes in a special file at the state level, similar to the garbage. And not to fault DPS or DBS for asking for it because state law requires that it gets asked for. It doesn't require that DBS does anything with it because in some ways, why would we rely on citizen report information when you have expert trained people documenting the crash, right? So I think that they're going to be working with the legislature to try to wipe that clean. Does that sound right, Joe?
Sounds right.
Okay, so I think the whole thing is going to just be nixed and we're not going to do it at all. But there will be a public portal to access this information, the crash information. And I don't know if that's quite live yet or not. Yeah. It's not? Okay.
All right. Please join me again in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.
We do actually have a speaker gift for you, which Jake will bring over. Two quick closing things. First of all, just to recap, or just a reminder, I should say, that we have our annual meeting coming up in early November. As Mr. Davis mentioned, it will involve whirly ball, which I have not done it before, but I'm told that it involves driving around in bumper cars and playing a game similar to lacrosse. So somewhere up in Maple Grove, I think it's just called whirly ball. Details are on the NCITE website. Please sign up. And then last and most important, Scott should have some data on our most popular candy. I'm sure that's what you've all been staying on.
Right. Reese's one followed by Snickers.
All right, Reese's followed by Snickers. Now you know what to get your neighborhood kids. So, all right, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying a little bit late. Thank you.